everybody. I'm delighted. My name is Martha Cole with the Montana Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our panel discussion, What's in a Name, in renaming Montana's peaks and buildings. I'm going to turn things right over to our moderator today, Senator Diane Sands, who will introduce our panelists and lead this discussion. So, Diane.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks to the Historical Society for agreeing to have this session. It's one we've been talking about for the last couple of years and finally came together for this session. I want to begin particularly because this topic and the name of this session, when we all greet each other coming in, what do you usually say to someone you don't know? Hi, I'm Diane Sands.
Hi.
Hi, Carol, where are you from?
I'm from Billings, Diane.
Hi, who are you? Where are you from? What is your place? Where did you come from? So this topic of place is very important, and names on places. With that, I think it's important to recognize we are on indigenous land. That is a place. It has names. And so these issues that I think there's no statement probably more appropriate to this workshop than that acknowledgement of land, that we're on indigenous land, to the issues that we want to talk about here today. This issue of naming, what's in a name, who gets to do the naming, who remembers the names, and now the process of removing names from some places, adding names to other places, and all of the politics and history involved with that is really a contemporary issue for historians, for people in the public arena, for the public as well. And we certainly are at it. There's a couple of ones that I want to mention just briefly in the last couple of years. For one, I don't know how many of you driven up to Flathead these days. When you go through the reservation, do you notice that every single place, highway signs have Salish on one side, Whitney on the others, English, and the interpretation of what that place name is. It tells you where you are in many contexts. And then certainly in Missoula, we just renamed a bridge for Bear Tracks, which is really one of the chiefs from the removal of the Salish from the Bitterroot. That's an important one. As legislators, Carol and I both know the whole process of naming sections of highway in memorial for various people, and that sometimes has been a kind of a contentious issue, but an important way of both acknowledging the contribution of place and of different people who made significant contributions. And then sometimes it's taking names off of things, and we look at issues like the recognition of much of Montana's white history in pre-Civil War Southerners moving to Montana, so issues like Confederate Gulch, etc. So all of these issues in some cases have had fairly hot public concerns and discussion around them, the changing of these names. So I wanted to have this session because I think having a historical perspective on these issues is really important. You know, it isn't just how we're thinking about it now, but how did they think about these issues? What did it mean to them? And now with our perspective, how do we think about place and names? And how should we think about the process? What are the factors in when we do remove 86 S-site names off of things, and when do we not, or when do we interpret them in a different way? So this panel is constructed to give you some information on some examples that we've done, and then to raise it for discussion so that we can all have maybe a better sense of where this kind of a historical issue is going in the public arena as well as within our institutions. So the three people that have agreed to do it, and I am so grateful: Michael Reidy from the university down in Bozeman, who teaches history. Sly way of not saying Montana State University. Actually, I worked there once. I'm equally as proud of MSU as you've been. Who's going to give us more of as a historian, what is the way that historians are now engaging with this issue and thinking about it. Dr. Pallister over here, a newly minted academic, is going to speak to his research having to do with eugenics in Montana and its history relative to some of our institutions. And my dear friend, Senator Carol Juneau, is going to talk about our work going back 15 years ago, or 20, in renaming 80-some sites throughout Montana, changing them from a derogatory, sexist, racist name to more appropriate names for our communities. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Michael.
All right.
You want to use hair?
Do I need the mic or can you hear this?
You have to.
All right.
Can you hear me? Is that good? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm not a Montana historian. I'm not a U.S. historian. I'm not even a very good historian. So I feel a little out of place, but it is a topic that I'm passionate about. And I've been asked to do an overview. Of course, that's impossible. If you know, if you're here, you know the importance of these questions, the controversies around monuments, about place names, about buildings. We're not the only state dealing with it. Every place is dealing with it, and historical societies, institutions of higher learning, governmental institutions in general are at the center of this. For me, it is a question of history. It's essential. In essence, it is primarily a question of history. History tells us, history's complex, right? The questions about naming are complex because people are complex. And the good thing is historians are very good with the complex. That's what we specialize in. History tells us, and I'll just quote from this lunch today. I just loved it. I thought it was just quite amazing. But it reminds us of who we are, what we come from, and what is to come. And I think that's an important part. History isn't just about the past. It also tells us about the future. I'm a Victorian England historian. To sort of paraphrase them, or to use a phrase they always use, how to act rightly. I'm going to give 3 examples. I'm going to take us out of Montana and go across the United States on 3 examples that I'm intimately familiar with, either through my research or otherwise. And there's 3 things. So let's say you're going to name a building after Jane Doe. There's 3 things we have to think about. Who was Jane Doe? What was the context in which she lived? What were the social and cultural forces at work there? Why did she believe or act the way she did? And then we have the time period where you name the building. And that's different. What was the context then? What were the social and cultural and intellectual, political, economic forces at work then? Why were they naming it that when they did? And then renaming. Today, that's a different context. It's the same question, right? Where are we? Why are we concerned about this? And how do we want to set up for our future? And I would argue, how do we want people to look at us when they are renaming the renaming 60 years, 80 years, 100 years from now? So I'm going to start with Ole Miss. I was born and raised in Oxford, Mississippi. Oxford is the home of Ole Miss. It has 2 Confederate monuments. One was at the center of the registration building, right outside the registration building in Ole Miss. So if you were a student, no matter what color, you had to walk by a Veterans Memorial from the Confederate Confederate Soldier Memorial to get into the registration building. There's also one in the center of town. All nice, beautiful towns like Oxford, Mississippi have a square. And on the Oxford Square is a Confederate memorial. So these were set up not during the Civil War or when the soldiers died, but both of them were put up in 1906. So what was happening in 1906? If you grew up in the South and you know Southern history, you know it wasn't good if you were a minority in the South in 1906. But it was also a scary time if you were a majority in the South in 1906. These statues, these memorials were put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy at a time when they weren't just honoring soldiers, of course, but they were following a lost cause ideology. The lost cause ideology declared that the war was about state rights instead of being about slavery and the subjugation of peoples. And it also argued 2 or 3 other things. That is a rewriting of history. You can see it on what they put on these monuments. One has a passage from Lord Byron describing the heroism of a small number of soldiers defending Venice from these horrid Turkish warriors in 1715. The other has that the soldiers, quote, gave their lives in a just and holy cause. But we know it wasn't just cause, and we know it wasn't holy. We know it wasn't, if it was about state rights, it wasn't primarily about state rights. It was about the subjugation of a population and the right to hold slaves. So the University of Mississippi actually decided to reach some sort of compromise, so they moved the monument. And they moved it to the cemetery, the Veterans Civil War Cemetery. Unfortunately, that turned out to be right across from the Ole Miss football practice field. And so all the football players were like, what the hell are you doing? And so then they erected this huge barrier in front of it that then fell apart during the first storm, and the whole thing was sort of nonsense.
With a sheet over it.
Yeah.
And of course, downtown, if you go to this beautiful place and you sit in the coffee shop where William Faulkner sat, you'd be staring right at the memorial to the Confederate soldiers. So here's a place where nothing really was done, and it's still a controversy, but it's under the rug, and it pops its head up here and there. Let me move to Western Washington University. Western Washington University was founded in 1893, and in 1969, they one of the first schools in the region to found a school for the environment. It was a science teaching school. And they named it the Huxley School of the Environment, after T.H. Huxley. Now, if you know T.H. Huxley, Huxley is Darwin's bulldog. If you know about Darwin, he publishes and then disappears like every other Victorian. He had all sorts of agony and woe. And so it was up to people like Huxley to defend the Darwinian worldview. He also did a lot of great science. He's the one that showed that birds were modern-day dinosaurs. He was the first to describe Neanderthal man and link it to humans. In fact, he did that by being the first person to apply evolutionary theory to man in a book called Man's Place in Nature. It's a fascinating, interesting read. It's also a book of its time. Darwin had argued that there had to be variations, that you couldn't figure out a species from a subspecies, from a variety, from etc. And he did the same thing with humans. He primarily contrasted apes with man, not different types of man or humans, but man, to show that there are anatomical similarities. But one of his most persuasive arguments, the same thing Darwin did, was to show that there were more differences among races of men than there were between the lowest man and the highest primates or apes. Now here's the rub, right? By lowest man, Huxley meant what he termed primitive man or savages, and he often used Aboriginal Australians as an example. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone, this is the Enlightenment Project, anyone that didn't place place humans on a hierarchy. In fact, that was the Enlightenment Project, that was the Darwinian project, to scientize this and make it so that you could identify anatomical differences. Well, people got pissed off about this, and they wanted the name change. And so Western Washington University started a task force, and the task force hired 4 experts, their opinion whether Huxley was a racist. So I got hired to talk about this. 2 other historians were world-renowned Huxley experts. They had written the biographies of Huxley. Another one was a world-renowned scholar of Humboldt, another scientist. He's a European. I'll call him the European. So they got together. all three of us, except the European, agreed that these are difficult questions, right? Huxley had done a lot. He is, in our view, if he were alive today, he would be a progressive liberal. He would be one of those leftists that all the rightists hated. He championed women's education, for instance, at a time when no one did that. He championed working class education. He always delivered his lecture in two places, one at the higher institutions and then always at what was called the working man's institutions. He, more than anyone, transformed biological education by bringing in the laboratory into the classroom. No one else had done that. It's his model that we follow in the United States. So it seemed obvious to me that they wouldn't change the name, and they changed the name from Huxley College. If you read the report, and I noticed this immediately because I teach Darwinian Revolutionist course, there were all these sorts of things in it that sounded like creationist literature. And faculty at Washington University noticed this as well and wrote a sort of 35-page reply to the statement that teased this out. It turns out the Europeanists in the group had argued, as I told you, sort of these racist sentiments that today seem racist that Huxley had, and called it Huxley's rule. Well, if you Google Huxley's rule, you won't get any hits. It's because Huxley's rule exists only in this European's head. It's not a real concept. But we do know that he's linked to young creationism and has given a lot of his talks and published in publications of new creationists or young creationists. So, ironically, renaming or denaming the college, in the end, nationally and internationally, might be a huge win for creationists and white supremacists and others that are backing this anti-evolutionary, anti-scientific sentiment. And then the time of naming is important. It's 1969. 1961 is when Western Washington actually became a university, and then they strove hard, or college, and they strove hard to be a university. They founded this new college. They wanted to be the main teaching institution, and they wanted that to be based on laboratory instruction. And so in 69, they named it after Huxley so that, which occurred in 77, they could get university status. So there were reasons why you would put a central figure like Huxley on the name of your college. The last example, so I've done monuments, I've done buildings, and I'll go to naming. I've been lucky enough to work with Janet Orr, who's in the audience, on a cultural historical resource study of Bears Lodge, Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And it's all-encompassing. I think it just came out, Janet. It's a wonderful document. One of the chapters is on climbing at the tower, and I'm a climbing mountaineering historian. So me, along with two graduate students, Jacob Northcutt and Travis Garcia, I don't know how to pronounce it. He's only been my student for 7 years. Took charge of that, and it's been an amazing project. I first went to Devil's Tower in 1989 to climb it. There was little about climbing when you went there. It was a geological feature. There was absolutely nothing about Native American presence that I remember, but I must admit I was pretty focused on climbing. I went back in 2010, again to climb it. It was still a geological feature, although there were prayer bundles everywhere, and a little bit, there were scopes up where you could see the climbers, and a little bit about Native American presence. And we went back there as a group in 2022 to climb it again, and I tell you, it's transformed. It's all about climbing, and it's all about Native American presence. They've redone almost everything in the museum, all the walking information as you tour around it. It's quite incredible. And the prayer bundles are majestic, and it has a spiritual feel to it, to the point where we decided not to climb it. that it wasn't a space to be climbed. Most of the maps, from the first maps in 57 to those in 1901, mark it as Bear's Lodge. It's a translation of a common Lakota name for the tower, Mato Tipi or Tepila. That changed with Richard Irving Dodge. Dodge is the one that described it as Devil's Tower. This is the same man that said every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, and he loved to kill buffalo. The first government maps in 1855 have it Mato Tipo or Bear's Lodge. This continues throughout the 1890s into 1900 when you start to get the name change, and then when it becomes its national park status, it has in 1906 it has the name Devil's Tower on it. This is where I think the climbing history is so interesting. I went to climb Durant's route, which I thought was the first route climbed in 1836, 1837. It's not. It was actually climbed in 1893 by two local ranchers. They actually piled in sticks and made a ladder and climbed it. What few people know is it was climbed on the 4th of July in an Uncle Sam suit so that they could plant an American flag on top. There's no more sort of imperial or settler colonial gesture in it. That's why in the 1890s, once you have gotten rid of all the Indians and you are trying to remake its history, you can forget about the name and you can rename it something that has meaning for you or demeaning for others. Because, of course, a name represents meaning that a place holds. It helps us remember what a place is, who lived there, and why it's important, and those things change. So, just in conclusion, I'll sort of wrap up. Give me 3 examples of these sorts of things. The first is in Mississippi, where there's been very little change at all, and I think it's causing problems. You have the second example where you do have change, and it too is probably for the worse, in my view, but we'll see. And then the third, where you also have no change, it's actually illegal to change the name, because that has to be done by the state of Wyoming. And at the first day of the first session, every single time the legislature meets, they pass a law that you can't change the name of Devil's Tower. Same thing is happening at Ole Miss with the monuments.
That's interesting.
But the difference between Bear's Lodge and, let's say, Huxley College is the education and the exposure and the ongoing engagement that's happening at the time. So a lot of people will say about history that it's not our job to judge. I don't agree with that. I think that if you rewrite the history of the reasons of the Civil War, we can point to that as saying, no, we know that's not correct. That's rewriting the history of it. If you say something is honorable and holy and it's not, and it wasn't at the time, then we can say so. We can also point out our heroes, warts and all. Huxley was a racist. He had racist views in the way that we would describe racism. He also did incredible things, perhaps more incredible than anyone in the 19th century for furthering science education. So, these changes, the way these debates are discussed, they're all about history. It's about the stories that we should tell, that we do tell. It is about, and some of those stories are wrong, and some of them are right, and most, are very, very complex. And it's this complexity that makes history so fun, but it's also why these discussions need to be engaged, and there needs to be full engagement by governmental institutions, by educational institutions, and especially historical societies like Montana Historical Society. But most of all, also, one of my great mentors, I know Pallister too, is Bob Rydell. And he used to always say, historians don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell the future. And I disagree with that as well. I think our job is to be very careful in judging, but our job is also to be very careful in telling the future. In these questions, we have to look at and see what kind of future we want to build. Just as we look at the characters themselves in the time and place, and then the characters who are naming the building in those time and place, we need to look closely at our own time and our own place and decide how to act rightly, how we want to live in the future. All right, thank you.
I think we need for this discussion to place the issues around naming and renaming and unnaming in a historical context and to talk about the values that are involved in this. Next, I want to bring up Carol Juneau, and Carol's an old friend of mine. Some of you may want to read all the biographies at length. It's in your packet. Mandan Hidatsa, a woman from Browning, most of the time, although she's in Billings for the moment, was the first president of the tribal college at the Blackfeet Community College, for those of you who want to know something about her long-term, in-depth experience as an educator. She has a lot to say about that. But she also has a political resume, and she and I both have served in the legislature. She started serving in the House in 1999, moved to the Senate in 2007, and was very involved in in fact, you carried the bill relative to Indian education for all that we all heard about earlier today. And in this discussion, she is the primary sponsor of the bill to rename many of our sites across the state that had the squaw word in it. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol to give us an example of what a process of renaming looked like and the amount of engagement that took in many parts of our community. So Carol?
Good. Thanks, Dan. Afternoon, everyone. As Diane said, I'm Mandan Hidatsa from Fort Berthold, North Dakota. Called the Mandan, the three affiliated tribes. We live along the Missouri River. We're there. We were Earth Lodge people at one point. And when you see or hear about the Garrison Dam or the Garrison Lake or Lake Sakakawea, that's where I'm from. When I was 8 years old, the Army Corps of Engineers built the dam down by Garrison in that area and flooded our community, and so we moved. And so we were one of the peoples that were in fact impacted by that flooding. And so that had a lot to do, I think, with me, I guess, growing up and what I did in our family. So, but thanks for including me in this conference. I usually have stepped back a lot and I don't participate in activities like this too much, but Senator Sands gave me a call and you don't say no to her too often. Anyway, it's been 24 years since the passage of House Bill 412. And House Bill 412 was the bill to remove the derogatory word squaw from place names in the state of Montana. In 1999, I was fortunate to take up this piece of legislation that Diane had carried the previous session. And we worked hard. Senator Carol Williams from Missoula was a strong supporter and an advocate with us, and many, many other people that stepped forward to help us to testify, to do the political work necessary for successfully passing this piece of legislation. And so it was passed and signed into law in 1999. And we had wonderful support. I looked through my old files on it and found, the people that came forward and testified, you sign in when you, at the legislature. A lot of tribal people, a lot of the tribal nations, the governments that came forward and stepped forward and said, yes, it's time for Montana to take these place names. that has the S word on it. Was not good for our the state to have that. And, words do matter. I think, as you've heard from the previous speaker, having this derogatory word on 76 sites in the state. And I've been able to, I've got a map and I've copied 20 copies. Some of you have seen it, some of you may be passing around. But that's a lot of sites. A lot was in the western part of Montana, the mountains, but a lot of sites with the S word, whether it be mountains, streams, buttes, valleys, and looking at history, we were talking, I don't know who named these, many, many years ago, but you can kind of figure out who might have named it. Dr. Henrietta Mann, who's a well-respected Cheyenne historian, she spoke at one of the hearings, and she said, language is infused with power, which can be used hurtfully, or it can create, heal, transform, and vitalize. Be guided by respect and reverse the arrogance and oppressiveness of power politics that violates the dignity of Indian women. U.S. Representative Pat Williams spoke at one of the hearings. He said, most ethnic groups in America have been subject to the ugly stain of raw, outright, naked racism, and Indians, unlike many of the groups, still experience it. We got this bill passed, and I was pretty darn excited about it and pleased. It was my first legislative session, and when you get a bill passed, it's a good feeling, and I was really happy with it. And it was a real important piece of legislation. And I thought, well, we've got it done, we're going to get those names changed, and we'll be done. But guess what? It takes a long time to do name changes, and it took us about 10 years to get this done. And some of you have there's a map or a little diagram of how to change a name. It's not just, hey, we really like this name, so let's do it. Or I'm not certain about buildings or places, but I know there's a group called the U.S. Board of Geographic Names that's kind of the final authority on place names. And so we had to go through that process for every single site that was on Montana. We had an advisory board that was appointed by the state coordinator of Indian Affairs, and so those were some of the best people to work with. They came forward and said, yes, I want to serve on this committee. They served without compensation, no mileage, no meals, nothing. But let me tell you why. If I had put some money in that piece of legislation, if I had said, we need $10,000 to do this or whatever, it would never probably have seen got through. So we got the bill passed, and we dealt with it afterwards, and we got people to volunteer and serve, and they did a good job. The U.S. Forest Service stepped forward. This bill didn't apply to them, that's federal land, but they stepped forward, and they had a representative who was very, very helpful in providing maps for us, resources for us. His name was Dale Florshinger. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes were one of the tribes that really stepped forward and took part in a lot of the name changes. They had two cultural committees, the Kootenai Cultural Committee and I believe the Salish Cultural Committee. And they went through their committee process themselves. They identified many names of their traditional names, their cultural names for those sites, and helped with that process. One of the first name changes that was done was here in Helena. And there was a school group called the Wakena Sky Program. They stepped forward along with their teachers, and you had a gulch out here with the S word on it, and they renamed it Wakena Sky Gulch. And so I think that was, I don't know if it was one of the first names, but it was great to have school children involved. So it's a good educational process for students, and they did accomplish, a great thing. Other place names in Montana. And again, on the map, if you have looked at it, you'll see, and hopefully you can read most of them, but most of the sites pertain to historical figures from that community, perhaps some surrounding names that was important to that area. We had the mountain right outside of Missoula. As you come in and you look west, kind of, there's a mountain, used to be called S Mountain. It is now called Shapakan, which is a Salish name, I believe, and it means shining peak. And so it's right on the borderline between Missoula area and Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes really helped with that name change. But it's an important one. You can see that peak, shining in the, especially when there's snow on top of it. It's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful that it has a new name. There's also Spirit Woman Butte in Fort Belknap. Many of the names honored, as I said, people perhaps, but also honored, not particularly just all native. There was some of the sites up near the, south of Fort Belknap in that area. There's a Russell, C.M. Russell area. So a couple of the sites there will be named for Nancy Russell. So you'll see that. So, and when we worked on the sites, you had to contact people in that local community, contact the county commissioners, let people know you were trying to change names and ask for recommendations. And so we got a lot of people's support, and most often people, helped and supported and sent in names, and then the advisory committee began the process of working on getting that name changed. 24 years later, Secretary of Interior, Deborah Holland, she's a Laguna Pueblo woman from New Mexico. She's the first Native American to serve as one of our U.S. cabinet members. She ordered the word squaw to be removed from more than 650 federal place names and formally declared squaw to be a derogatory term. So I said, that's really quite an accomplishment. It's quite a thing. I was so pleased that she did that. So it was a special place in my heart for doing that, so that work. The Interior Department, in their writing on that, said the term has historically been used as an offensive, ethnic, racial, and sexist slur, particularly for Indigenous women, and so that was part of the article there. I do want to let you know also that this word, the bill applied only to state place names. So the federal government stepped up and said, yes, we're going to change names on that. So there are probably sites still in Montana, county sites, local sites, private property sites that carry that name that hopefully at some point, that they'll work on changing that. Happy to be a part of this and look forward to some questions if you have. Appreciate being part. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Carol. We need to talk about some of the opposition in the question and answer section. But there's a good example of community engagement of schools, etc., to learn this process of what it takes really to change names. That it's involved and it has requirements if you're dealing with the maps and the U.S. Board of Geographic Names. Our last presenter about a Montana-related issue who's been thinking about and working on this issue is Dr. Casey Pallister. He holds a PhD in history from Montana State University, which has an excellent history program, I'm told, where he's focused on the issue and the history of eugenics. And this goes to, I think, some of the issues that Michael talked about the earlier era of Montana history and some of its progressive movement, which has its dark sides, and one of those includes eugenics. So with that, I give you Dr. Pallister.
Good. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Senator Sands for the invitation, and it's great to see a full house. This is kind of a strange talk for me, and I'm going to try to give you some history and historical process all at the same time. And this situation with building names for eugenicists is still in what I would call the infancy stage. So we're not quite as far along as some other projects. First of all, I always like to start with context, as Dr. Reidy said. Context matters. So what is eugenics? Eugenics is an idea born in the late 1800s that you could pair certain humans together and produce certain offspring. Just that simple. Fit offspring or unfit offspring. And of course, who decides who is fit and unfit? People that are in power, right? A very simple explanation of eugenics, I know, but it becomes an idea that saturates society, not only in the progressive era, but beyond. So it makes its way into public education, mental testing, these better baby contests. I don't know if you've heard about these, where you can attend a state fair or a county fair in the early 1900s, including in Montana, and have your baby eugenically judged and ranked in relation to other babies. Things like that. And then also laws, and these are the things that dominate most of our discussion academically. So ways to identify, segregate, and then sterilize people that are deemed unfit, or what we would call negative eugenics. And those individuals are typically, using the language of the day, considered feeble-minded or insane. My interest in this subject in part came from a personal connection. My grandfather is Dr. Philip Pallister, who was the head physician at the Boulder Institution for about 30 years, from 1950 into the 1980s. And in his unpublished autobiography, he talked about performing eugenic sterilizations. And it was a very small piece, just a paragraph, a few lines. But it intrigued me that was in there. And then what I found even more intriguing was that simple explanation of his eugenic past made its way into an academic article with no further explanation. And then later in 2018, Shodair Hospital here in Helena named their genetic laboratory after him. And in doing that, did not, in the dedication ceremony or in press, we didn't see any mention of a eugenic past. So that I found really intriguing. I'm always interested in memory and the malleability of it, and what happened to the memory of eugenics in Montana. I think there's a common narrative to eugenics in relation to the United States that needs to be put out there. And it's something that you'll see in popular writing. The recent Ken Burns documentary on the gene has this sort of trajectory. Basically, the idea is that eugenics is the brainchild of a few crackpot scientists who serve as the stand-ins, I think, for everybody else in society, are the most blameworthy. And there's this pretty simplistic timeline as well. So basically, the progressive era is the height of the eugenic movement, the fervency of it, the most sterilizations, and then things die after 1945. And the idea is, or the argument is, that Americans, upon discovering the horrors of Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, as well as their T4 program, which led to the euthanasia of thousands of disabled persons, had this moral reckoning, and eugenics ceased to exist in American society. Or those who proposed or continued to support it were outcasted, crackpots. And then when we talk about eugenics today, too, in relation to the United States, we have certain states that serve as stand-ins, and they're almost always tied to those sterilization numbers. California looms largest, 20,000 sterilizations over the course of its eugenic laws. And Virginia is another one. So we don't often hear about what I would call middling states like Montana, who fall somewhere in the middle of the 30 or so states that pass sterilization laws in terms of officially recorded sterilizations. So in Montana, there's little mention of eugenics in academic or popular writing. And most people I just spoke to about the subject were surprised that it even existed here. Montana, though, in other localized studies, and what I mean by that is like state studies that have been taking place over the last 10, 20 years, are offering what I think are counter narratives or counter memories or layers of complexity maybe to this too simplistic attempt at a universal story of eugenics in the United States. And so I'll say a few things about Montana. I wish I could talk for an hour about it, though. It's really interesting. But, one is that Montana challenges this timeline that we have about Nazism being the end of eugenics in America. Montana had 2 sterilization laws. The first passed in 1923, which created a board of eugenics that approved sterilizations put forward by the state's 2 what we call feeder institutions at Warm Springs and Boulder, which still exists today. Then there was a second law in 1969, a refurbished eugenics law, which supposedly, according to its proponents, gave patients more of a say in their sterilization. And that's important to note because this is at a time, as you probably know in American history, when there are widespread movements throughout the nation for civil rights, including rights of disabled persons. And from 1969 to 72, Montana leads the nation in the number of sterilizations it's performing per capita. So we can toss out that simplistic narrative that eugenics disappears. And then in terms of actors in the eugenic movement and victims, the Montana case shows something pretty interesting. The 1923 law was the product of a concerted effort by multiple women's organizations who came up with a legislative agenda in 1923 for that session that included a sterilization bill. And the law that passed that session was a word-for-word replica of their agenda. They were not the first to try to push a eugenic sterilization law in the state. For at least a decade, men in the legislature had worked to do this, but the organization of the women's movement at that time allowed them to get it through. And so we have this different picture of who's involved in the eugenics movement beyond the scientists, right? It's celebrated men and women in positions of power throughout society. And then I think victims, we often see them, I think, in statistical terms when we're talking about the broader story of the U.S. engagement with eugenics. But we don't really interrogate them in great depth, at least from a popular perspective. And what I found was that in Montana, this is incredibly important because most targets of eugenics in this state were youth and adolescents. Not only in indoctrination, say in a eugenics course at public school or mental testing designed to segregate people, but also the average age of a sterilized individual in Montana was 17. And the youngest I found was a girl who was 10. I also think that's really important to get at this story. Who were the people, not just the numbers.
Was it always just women?
I think Montana also challenges an idea that can be a way to apologize for eugenics. And that is that the people performing sterilizations always believed in hereditary transmission of feeble-mindedness or insanity. And so they were performing that surgery with this belief. The Montana case shows that sometimes that was the case, but sometimes it was not. Local communities would petition institutions related to so-called problem families in the community. And these were typically poor people that had a number of children and sometimes had run-ins with law enforcement or with the Children's Bureau. They were reported to the institution as being problems needing to be taken care of. And those problems were almost always women. And so there were cases where women were institutionalized, not because they were declared feeble-minded, but because that was the only site you could legally sterilize somebody against their will. I found that in the 1930s and 1940s, 25% of all patients at Boulder were related, which is a pretty interesting thing. Sterilizations weren't just eugenic. So part of the law allowed physicians to choose a suitable means to sterilize. And so I also found that several sterilizations that took place were castrations of men. And they weren't done for eugenic purposes. And my grandfather participated in these, I discovered as well. They were done to men who were homosexual, who were perceived to be pedophilic, or in one case, a disabled person in the Helena community who was caught stealing women's undergarments, sent to Boulder, castrated, sent home. So I could go on, but we have a popular memory. We have a counter memory. And there's many counter memories. And then we have a sort of historical amnesia. I mean, I hear all of you moaning as I'm giving you this information, right? And growing, it's heavy. So how is it possible we've forgotten? So as I was researching, I found that a number of individuals, like my grandfather, who had an important role in eugenics, were celebrated people, and they were, presidents of universities, physicians, political figures, professors, and they had sites named after them at some point in time in Montana history. No site had any sort of language about or information about their eugenic past, whether on signage at the location, on the website, or anywhere. And I found 7. That isn't to say there isn't more, but that's what I found. So, of course, the Schroeder Pallister Medical Laboratory, Genetic Laboratory. There's the Mariah Dean Center at St. Peter's Hospital, just down the street. Mariah Dean was one of the first female physicians in the state, a hugely important figure in the women's suffrage movement, but also a passionate eugenicist who published articles with the Vineland Training School Bulletin in Vineland, New Jersey, one of the hotbeds of eugenic research in the nation. There is the Cogswell building, just down the street as part of the Capitol complex, named for Dr. William Cogswell, who was a huge figure in the eradication of Rocky Mountain spotted fever and the founding of what is now Rocky Mountain Lab in Hamilton. A lot to celebrate, but also the head of the Board of Eugenics for about 25 years. On the campus of University of Montana, we have Elrod Hall. Elrod is named for Morton Elrod, Dr. Morton Elrod, a professor of biology who introduced eugenics courses at University of Montana, was a passionate, racist, misogynist, and anti-immigrant professor who passed that information on to his students and who then gave it back in essays. And this is all, I can say this because it's all in the papers at the Mansfield Library, including the student essays. He also was a frequent lecturer in at public events in Missoula. He had a huge role in curriculum development for science throughout the Northwest. And Elrod Hall is named, and the website simply says, for an esteemed professor. Then we have McGill Hall, Carolyn McGill, another celebrated early physician, important figure in Montana history, presided on the Board of Eugenics for many years. The Atkinson Building at Montana State University, named for a former president and outspoken eugenicist. The Lynn Banks McMullen Hall at Montana State University, Billings, named for the founding of what was then, I believe, Montana Normal College, or something of that nature. The founder of that, and he, in the 1930s, at a commencement address in Colorado, praised Hitler's policies of sterilization, saying they would do more for civilization than education would in the next 50 years. So we have all of this information. And after I completed my dissertation, I decided I would write a newspaper article about this and base it around interviews and draw some sort, see what sort of reaction I could draw. But my interest is in memory, and I want to see where those went. I didn't have an idea that there was a grand conspiracy cover-up. That would have been intriguing. But I first approached Montana State University buildings, and I did it because I had this direct quote about Hitler, and it's really hard to ignore some reference to Hitler. And I approached the administration with the information. They passed that to the history department, who vetted it immediately. I mean, it was within about a day. And they responded as a faculty saying that they thought that this building needed to be renamed, and there needed to be a process behind that. The kind of process that's been talked about, careful, but an engagement of multiple stakeholders, conversations, things of that nature. The sign for the hall was pretty quickly taken down, from what I understand, and the press was alerted by the university that they had this information, and they were considering what to do. Other sites that I talked to all condemned eugenics, and all stressed the importance of the current values of inclusivity and diversity. And I don't doubt those things. But now we're about 1 year later, almost exactly a year later since the publication of this newspaper article. And even at the Montana State Billings, things have really stalled. There haven't been in any site or any institution public discussions, anything that I've seen in the press, no follow-up press at all after this initial article that I've seen. And if you go to the websites, there's no added information about eugenic pasts. So this is significant. I would say that, I'm supposed to be up here talking about a controversy, but I don't think we're at that stage in this state. To me, this is still in the phase of resurrection. So the information is there. What will we do with it? Will we continue to sit on it? And what will people think in the future about us if we do? So I can't say where this will go. I'm just not sure. But I do know that something needs to happen. And my hope is that it begins in the same way that the previous speakers were talking, with an idea to understand, contextualize the namings, the commemoration, and to try to hear from multiple voices in this process. But we need to decide, first of all, that there's a process. Thank you.
Good.
I know you all find that absolutely fascinating. It's the only session I think I've heard people gasp. I would also say that I think the largest without consent sterilization happened to Native American women. It happened on reservations during particularly the 60s and 70s until we organized to stop that. And it was without consent or knowledge in most cases. So a lot of history there. So you've heard some of the issues related to this. We'll ask some questions in a second. But I want to start by asking the professor here to talk a little bit about process, since I think you've been engaged to some degree with the institution about how universities as an institution make decisions about naming. This came up in Missoula. The University of Montana was looking at giving Jeanette Rangan a honorary doctorate. She's been deceased for some time. And the faculty, I think based, you'll be pleased to know, based in part on your work, Casey, that was raised, the faculty said absolutely not, because she also was involved in this, as was, I'm going to say, every prominent person probably of that progressive era. So the decision not to give her an honorary doctorate was based, dare to get some credit for that one, on this discussion around not honoring people that have a connection to that history. But to some degree, these become policy issues like state buildings. There is a process for naming buildings, and I don't know, I know you've been involved in this relative to the university system. Do you want to comment on what's how they're working through a process for this?
Yeah, just briefly, I only know about Western Washington University. I think people accuse universities of being very liberal institutions. Of course, it's the exact opposite. They're extremely conservative, and change comes about slowly. But I think one of the important lessons is that this was started by students, and that's how I think change happens at universities. That's my experience. And they were bold and smart and energetic students who started this. A committee was formed. It has a Board of Regents system, so it has to go through all that and then get voted on by the Board of Regents. And I think if there's a failing, and maybe Huxley's name should have been changed, but maybe not. But I think if there was a kink in the chain, it was to hear all voices and have a very inclusive task force. And the task force was loaded from the start in that process. And so that's one of the things I think that I learned from it. I'll give one more example. We have a retention process at the university happening right now, and we just started a moral scholars program for about 400 undergraduates. And I was tasked with looking into the name of the Moral Act. And it turns out he's pretty squeaky clean. He's He championed working class education with the Morrill Act, and then also was partly responsible for the second Morrill Act. He had died, but that ended up creating the historically black colleges and universities. But the Morrill Act, the land grants, of course, is indigenous land. And not only indigenous land that they had stolen earlier, but places in the East had already gotten rid of all the Native Americans. And so they actually took land from places like Montana and then used the resources there. And some of that land is still being used for that and then shipped to the Iowa states of the world. And so, it's not, we decided to go with the name of Morrill because it's a good opportunity for us to talk about these issues, and we thought that rather than not using that name and using some other name, it would be a good thing. But these processes start, I think, in that way, through education and looking into it and committee work, and then it goes up the stages.
Well, I think as you brought up, there are times where clearly it's appropriate because it's so egregious just to remove the names, which is what we did with the S word. There are other educational opportunities to leave a name in place, but to do the educational work that needs to be done, at least as part of it, to place it in a context. We can't just deny and erase our history. It's still there, even if we pretend like it's gone. But there was a question back here. We'll do a couple of questions and see where it goes. Yep.
Yeah, I guess a question for Casey, but maybe everybody. And you're emphasizing process, which I think is really important. But how unusual is the eugenics, naming places after eugenics? How unusual is that really? Isn't that just a subset of a way in which lots of places have been named after people who have questionable backgrounds? In the small town where I live on Jefferson Street, in the shadow of Mount Jefferson. When I open my back porch, the sound of running water goes into the Jefferson River. Jefferson, if you read his notes on the state of Virginia, believed in, I don't think it was pre-eugenics, but he definitely believed in the inferiority of African American people. He was a slaveholder. He could be quite brutal. I was born and raised in the settler colony, otherwise known as Washington State. Should all of these things, should we have processes for examining all of our place names and use this as a means to educate ourselves more about our history? Is eugenics all that unusual? Not, Casey, to diminish your findings and their significance and their power and all that, but is this actually a piece of a much larger problem in American history that, maybe a process of the sort that you're describing would be a good
That's the point of this workshop.
Thank you, Dr. Fiji, for that question. I do think that eugenics is something that you can see as pretty pervasive, and so it can become easy to say, everyone was doing it and have that kind of diminish the significance of it, or every prominent person was doing it. And my response to that is it's just not accurate. There's enough people in any generation throughout the history of eugenics that said no to that way of thinking. Scientists at the time, the 1923 law in Montana was opposed by numerous groups and legislators who argued against it as inhumane pseudoscience, who argued that it involved cruel and unusual punishments and violated the Constitution. They're people of their times also. So why do we focus on who we call prominent people and their values and visions as the visions and values of all the people at that time? And I think about the people thinking about eugenics if they did around the dinner table, And there's this interesting example, that's in this magazine, Woman's Home Companion, which was read by many, many people throughout the nation in the early 1900s, and they were huge promoters of Better Baby contests, and they were interviewing this man who had a prize-winning baby, and they always did this because they wanted to know, what are you feeding? They believed in epigenetic ideas too, that your environment, contributed to a better baby also. So you leave your windows open, you don't get tuberculosis, and you always feed breast milk and this and that. So what are you feeding your baby? So because it's a prize winner, and he says ice cream at every meal. So there's a person, just an average nameless individual, who doesn't really take this seriously. People went to those contests for health checkups sometimes. People went because they believed in the science. But we need to, I think, consider all of these people as having voices. And in this narrative for so long, they just do not.
Other questions, or people out there who've been involved in these renaming processes?
Well,
Yes or next?
it's not renaming, it's using people's names in the first place. And something you haven't mentioned happened just within the last few years, naming a building on the Montana State University campus after a candidate who is quite well named, is now our governor. And, you got a building named after a person, doesn't that give them a little boost in terms of name recognition? And so I would call into question the whole idea of naming places after people, particularly when, like recently, and it's not just here, wealthy people get buildings named after.
And I think there's a university policy not to name buildings after people that are still living, unless it's unusual circumstances, like they have $10 million. History will judge him, and it's time.
Sandave, Nanihan Nolan Brown, Sasoni Ben Nightdit, Fort Hall Nakan. The Language and Cultural Preservation Department, Original Territories and Historical Research Office. So, good afternoon. I'm Nolan Brown. I work for the Shoshone-Bannock Tribes Language and Culture Preservation Department, and I just want to thank you, Senator, for starting the process and for giving me work to do. But in all seriousness, this topic of discussion and the importance of it and the impacts that it will have, lasting impacts, has such, we could talk about it all day, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I'm in the thick of it. My colleague, Bailey Dan here, just started working in our office, and she's learning these things along with me and seeing how these actions have come about. But for me, the derogatory order by Secretary Holland, that was a whirlwind process. We had months turnaround. There were 664 names on that list, and our tribe submitted a petition for 65 of them in both our languages, Shoshone and Bannock. So we had 130 place names that we submitted, and each one of those, maybe we didn't have a story, maybe we created a contemporary description of an area, but they were in recognition of our women, honoring our women, of using their names that they were known by, or describing relationships, like we had Little Sister Creek and Big Sister Creek in our language, when before it was, of course, you know what it was before. And so we are just in the thick of it, and the process continues. Just last month, we had the renaming by the decision of the Board of Geographic Names on the Jeff Davis features. And that was another quick process that we were kind of drawn into. And there's others throughout Idaho, throughout Montana, of course, that we want to address. But it's such a daunting task, but it's good work. Thank you.
Thank you. That's why it took us 10 years to go through that process, because like on the Missoula Peak, it took the Culture Committee 3 years to agree on what the naming would be, because you can't just randomly replace that word with Indian woman or something like that. They're specific to the site. I mean, occasionally we got desperate and named one after dragonflies or something, and the National Board of Geographic Names said, "So, can you tell us something specific about that?" And we just said, "No." You got to have a name, and that's it. But there was opposition. I remember one former senator colleague of ours, when I called him about the site, "Close your ears, you don't want to hear this said," and because it was on his land partly, and he said, "Nope, not doing it. If you want to tell me I'll tell you, every buck will tell you his wife's the squad. I said, Bob, this conversation's over.
Yeah.
So there are sites out there
Yeah.
that are not changed because of attitudes like that. But for the children growing up, to go up and see a name that's respectful and not a disrespectful name, it's just got to be so important to our identity of our children. So I think it was really, yes?
I have a question. Is the United States the only country who's going through this renaming issue, or is this happening worldwide?
You know?
I don't know.
I have no idea.
It's certainly happening in England.
There's some in Australia.
Other countries.
Australia?
Yeah, Uluru, I mean,
South Africa, too.
there's been renaming out there.
Right. Other questions or comments? Gigi?
One anecdote, maybe for future thought. I went to a meeting at the University of Montana where the administration had invited people to look at a list of all the buildings that had names, and those that did not yet have names.
Oh, God.
And I looked at the list, and the ones that did not yet have names were called things like the Social Science Building. I thought to myself, here we are with functional things that aren't people, but we're going to put them on a special list and maybe give them to everyone to see if they have $10 million. They can name these things.
Right.
I thought, good grief. So I think for the future we might think of unnamed as well as a category that sometimes we could think for the future. Perhaps it should stay unnamed.
Yeah.
Good point. Kim Bergman.
I just wondered what was the ruling on the Jeff Davis rename?
Well, the ruling, we were in on the virtual meeting, and I didn't quite understand what was happening while that happened, but they voted to bundle both features of Jeff Davis Peak and Jeff Davis Creek, and then they selected one of each feature from the Confederate Salish Kootenai Tribes petition, and then one from ours. So the Peak is now just Three Eagles Peak, and then the creek is Doyavi Nai Ba Ogwit, which means water flowing from the mountain in Shoshone language.
Nice.
Yeah, so that was the outcome there. But of course, us being Shoshone-Bannock and wanting to represent the tribes, we didn't agree with that. And if we go to put interpretation on there, I'm going to have to correct the historical, timeline and location, because Lewis and Clark came through that area, the Horse Prairie Valley. They met our chief, our leader, Gemiowit there, and they didn't meet Three Eagles until they went 70 miles, to the northwest at Ross's Hole. So, maybe we'll have to submit another petition, but it's a serious thing. Our elders, from both tribes, our culture committees, the staff, we met in nation-to-nation consultation and couldn't work it out, but there's still the opportunity for that. And, who knows, maybe we'll find a solution. Maybe we'll have to gamble and play stick game and see who wins. Something there has to continue to change.
Perhaps one solution is, as they've done on the Flathead, on one side of the sign it's in one language, and on the other side it's in the other language. But, the Salish put out a wonderful book, if you haven't seen it, which is place names. So everywhere you have ever been in Montana or anywhere else has other names. You just need to raise that question to yourself when you're driving through. I wonder what other people call this place. What were the other names for it? And why should some of them be restored that would reflect more of the diversity of Montana?
I don't want to raise another whole issue, but I was thinking about mascots and names of sports teams and what goes into renaming those and the pressure that's put on. I mean, there's not going to be a law that says NFL teams have to change, or I doubt. But I think one of the strategies that I'm not terribly informed about is that groups have been doing research on the impact of mascot names on mostly Native American children in terms of identity and self-esteem and that sort of thing, which would be an argument toward change, although not everybody would care about that or respond to it or anything. So I thought that's an interesting way to try to go at making changes to show the impact.
Spoken like a true professor of social work. Advice well taken. Other comments from people?
I just wanted to ask Casey, because you've been really upfront about your grandfather, right? Being somebody who has a building named after him, and you found this. I wanted to know what Thanksgivings are like. What is your family like? Are you on a campaign to change it? Yeah, just yeah. And you don't have to answer.
Thank you for the questions. Our Thanksgivings are pretty separate. So it's a big family, 13 siblings. The thing about my grandfather, there are different interpretations of him in our family, and it's obviously based on your experience of knowing him, right? So I have to, as a historian, alert people to that bias, that I'm not just viewing him as a person who participated in eugenics as a physician. He was also my grandfather, who I have good memories of and not so good memories of, and that informs how I do my work. But when I think about my grandfather, I think a little bit about what Dr. Reidy was saying. Our heroes, we can look at them warts and all. He's somebody I think about. So he's, if you Google search Pallister and babies, my hope would be that you'd find my Better Babies article on Google. But actually what you would find is Pallister-Killian syndrome, which is a genetic disease he helped discover. While at Boulder, he performed orthopedic surgeries with Dr. Ronnie Losi from Ennis that gave patients mobility that they didn't have before in their lives. The article that came out about him, where I mentioned the reference to eugenics, was called "We Had to Start Treating Them More Like Humans." And that was a quote from him in relation to patients at Boulder. And so what you have is a person who is a person. And I took that quote actually of that title, and I use it in my dissertation to say we can reverse that and apply it to these people too. My grandfather, for example. I have to start treating him like a human. He's not just a eugenicist. He did good things. He did things that are difficult. And so that makes it challenging to name buildings after people, because I think to do it responsibly, we have to view them holistically. We can't treat them like they're one-dimensional, or we deny some part of their humanity. So everyone has something to celebrate, and we all have our skeletons as well.
Are you for adding information, like when we talk about these statues, and instead of taking the name off, as we talk about, but adding that bit where you said there's this erasure of memory, but actually that could be a whole new educational thing, is leave the name on there, but then you have this whole other, I don't know. I mean, I think naming is so problematic, but maybe that's an opportunity, and that says something about us now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's representative of our values today, and I think just simple erasure is problematic for sure. It's another way of whitewashing history.
Right.
It's easy, very easy to forget. And so I think some of the most well-done renamings have been doing what you're saying. They provide context. At one point, this building was named this, and here is why. It was renamed this, and here is why. And you see that at like Sand Creek, for example. It was once called a battle, and it's also a massacre, right? So there was signage calling it a battle at one point, then a massacre. So we need to understand that these commemorations have their own histories, and we can't erase, or we're losing.
Thank you. And if you haven't read his excellent article in the Montana Magazine, you should read it. It's wonderful. Having retired from the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, when I was looking through the Salish book on the name for that word, what was the Salish name for Fort Missoula? Anybody here know? It means the place of the killers. So, I think it's interesting for all of us in whatever worlds you're involved in to start looking at this issue, because it reflects the values of both who we have been, who we are, but who we want to be. And so I think engaging our history in these issues is really critical. for all of us. And I'm so grateful that all of you showed up for this.